This lecture is titled Trends and Orientation in African Philosophy. We are going to aim to achieve two objectives in this lecture. The first objective will be to state the major orientations in African philosophy. Then the second objective will be to discuss these stated orientations. But before we begin, I'd like you to understand that in the discourse of African philosophy, there are two major orientations. The first orientation is the traditionalist orientation. Then the other orientation is the modernist orientation. Now, the traditionalist orientation simply holds that when we are embarking on the discussions in African philosophy, our culture or cultural raw material should be the basis for discussion in African philosophy. That is, the traditionalists are of the view that African tradition, African cultural practices, and African traditional way of doing things should be the basis for discussions in African philosophy. While on the other hand, the modernists are of the view that it is not impossible that there are some things in our cultures that are not really viable. So if we use culture, African traditional culture, as the resources or raw material for African philosophy, that means we are saying that everything about our culture is right. So they take a divergent route from the traditionalists by arguing that for us to have a basis for discussion in African philosophy, we must look beyond the resources of culture to science, technology, and logical reasoning. Now, this debate between the modernists and the traditionalists is at the heart of discussions in African philosophy. Now, because scholars do not agree on what should constitute the basic process or the basic method of doing African philosophy, that is what now led to the orientations that we are about to discuss. Let us attempt stating these major orientations. We have the following orientations. 1. Ethnophilosophy. 2. Philosophic sagacity. 3. Nationalist ideology philosophy. Then we now have the number 4, the professional philosophers. Now, apart from these four major orientations, there's also a more recent orientation referred to as the hermeneutic narrative philosophy. All of these shall be discussed in what follows. Let us begin by looking at ethnophilosophy. What is ethnophilosophy? Ethnophilosophy is the philosophical perspective that is championed by certain African scholars like Shodipo, like Barry Allen, and others. And their argument is simply that African philosophy should be done by looking at our culture. That is, our culture should constitute the basis of discussion in African philosophy. That is, if we are talking about philosophy within Africa, what should serve as our resources is looking at how Africans have reacted or how Africans conceive of philosophical concepts like death, reincarnation, immortality, causality, and so on. So for them, what should be the basis for discussion in African philosophy should be our worldview, our cultural norms, our cultural practices, our proverbs, our sayings, our songs, and so on and so forth. Now, the philosophic sagacity orientation is of the view that within Africa, there are certain philosophers that can be referred to as sages. And these philosophers are referred to as custodians of culture. They are knowledgeable, they are very knowledgeable, and have understanding about cultural practices within their communities. And apart from this cultural knowledge, they also have the capacity to dialogue and critically reflect on these views about different aspects of the African worldview. So the philosophic sagacity school of thought is now saying that we can put the notions or the views of these philosophers forward as viable philosophy that can be referred to as African philosophy. Then the nationalist ideology philosophy simply refers to the philosophy that championed the independence struggle in Africa. You know that after colonialism, there was a struggle, by African scholars and even philosophers and thinkers, or if you like, thought leaders, that they had to use a philosophy to fight their cause. People like Julius Nyerere, Kwame Nkrumah, Obafemi Awolowo, Nnamdi Azikiwe, to mention a few, they championed different theories, socialist theories, some even combined democratic theories with socialist theories. They used different theories and came up with different notions on how development, Africans should be on the path to development. So in this context, the nationalist ideologist philosophy are simply saying that if we are talking about African philosophy, then we should be referring to this philosophy that flourished in this period. That is the philosophy that brought about independence in most African countries. Apart from these three mentioned orientations, there is also another orientation, which is the fourth, referred to as the professional philosophy orientation. In this school of thought, these philosophers here are modern philosophers that are trained in academic philosophy, and they believe that for anything to be called African philosophy, it should be equated, it should have the capacity, to be equated with other philosophies, especially Western philosophy. And they believe that there are certain rudiments, there are certain elements that we must find in a philosophy for it to qualify as philosophy. For instance, if you are talking about philosophy, that philosophy must have some elements of logic. It must have some elements of documentation. You see, and they've argued that in the philosophy championed by the ethno-philosophers, all of these things are lacking. And they were against a cultural methodology for African philosophy. Rather, they championed the view that for us to have African philosophy, we must have certain elements of science, technology, and development as our basic focus. And insofar as these elements constitute the basic focus of philosophy, then we can begin to talk of African philosophy. So for them, they do not believe that cultural data should serve as the basis for philosophy in Africa. Rather, they believe that philosophy must involve logical reasoning, scientific thinking that will help to fashion out authentic means for development in Africa. Now, apart from these four major orientations we have already discussed, there's a more recent orientation which is referred to as the hermeneutic narrative philosophy. And this philosophy flourished in the 1970s up to today. It has flourished even up from 1970s up to this moment. Now, what is the basic claim of the narrative philosophy in African thought? Now, what they simply, by hermeneutics, we simply mean interpretation. That is the broad definition of hermeneutics. Now, African philosophers are now saying that this method of interpretation should be used as a methodology of doing African philosophy. That is, they hold that African culture or the data of African culture should be subjected to scientific interpretation. By scientific interpretation, they mean rigorous analysis, conceptual analysis that will bring about further analysis and developmental prospect. So these orientations I've mentioned so far are the trends and orientations in African philosophy. By way of summary, I have tried to discuss firstly the two views on African philosophy, that is the traditionalist and the modernist orientation, and how this modernist and traditionalist orientation brought about the major orientations that we have discussed. And we have discussed the following orientations in African philosophy, namely ethnophilosophy, philosophic sagacity, professional philosophy, nationalist ideologist philosophy, and hermeneutic narrative philosophy. And I believe that with this exposition we have attempted in this lecture, we should have some basic understanding on the trends and orientations in African philosophy. I want to thank you for your attention, And I also want to thank you for giving me your time. Thank you very much.